In the summer of 1944, one of the most brilliant military operations of the Second World War unfolded on the Soviet-German front. The Bobruisk operation became a true pearl of Soviet military art and a standard for conducting encirclement in the most difficult conditions of forested and swampy terrain. This operation, carried out as part of the strategic offensive Bagration, forever changed the course of the war on the Eastern Front. In a matter of days, the troops of the First Belarusian Front, under the command of Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky, encircled and practically completely destroyed a large enemy grouping, delivering a crushing blow to the German Army Group center. The Bobruisk operation became a vivid example of how competent planning, command mastery, and the heroism of soldiers can overcome even the most complex natural obstacles and break through a deeply echeloned enemy defense. It was here, in the Belarusian forests and swamps, that the Soviet command demonstrated the highest level of operational art, creating a classic example of an encirclement operation that is still studied in military academies around the world. By the summer of 1944, the strategic situation on the Soviet-German front had fundamentally changed. After the winter-spring offensive operations, the Red Army liberated right-bank Ukraine, Crimea, and a significant part of the Leningrad region. The front line acquired a characteristic configuration, with a salient in the central part, which went down in history as the Belarusian balcony. This salient deeply penetrated Soviet territory and was held by the German Army Group Center under the command of Field Marshal Ernst Busch. Army Group Center was considered one of the most powerful German formations on the Eastern Front. It included 4 field armies: the 3rd Panzer, 4th, 9th, and 2nd. The total strength of the grouping was about 500,000 personnel, 700 tanks and assault guns, and more than 10,000 artillery systems. The Bobruisk salient, held by the 9th Army of the Wehrmacht under the command of General Hans Jordan, had special strategic significance. It covered the most important communications leading to Poland and East Prussia. The loss of this area would mean a catastrophe for the entire German defense in Belarus. The German command perfectly understood the importance of the Bobruisk direction. Over 3 years of occupation, a powerful defensive system was created here, consisting of 3 lines with a total depth of up to 80 kilometers. The first defensive belt included 2 or 3 positions with a developed system of trenches, pillboxes, and anti-tank obstacles. Special attention was paid to anti-tank defense. In tank hazardous directions, the mine density reached 2,000 mines per kilometer of front. The city of Bobruisk was turned into a powerful fortified area, with reinforced concrete firing points, anti-tank ditches, and minefields. The Berezina River, flowing through the city, served as a natural obstacle reinforcing the defense. The Germans considered Bobruisk an impregnable fortress, capable of withstanding any offensive. Their confidence was reinforced by the fact that previous attempts by Soviet troops to break through the defense in this area had been unsuccessful. However, by the summer of '44, the balance of power had shifted against the Wehrmacht. Germany's resources were depleting, while Soviet military industry was gaining momentum, and the combat experience of the Red Army was steadily growing. The theater of operations where the Bobruisk operation unfolded represented a classic example of the East European forest-swamp landscape. This region of Belarus, known as Polesia, is characterized by a complex combination of natural factors that decisively influenced the planning and conduct of military operations. Dense coniferous and mixed forests covered more than 60% of the territory, creating natural obstacles for the maneuver of large troop formations and significantly limiting visibility and observation capabilities. Swamps, occupying up to 25% of the area, made the movement of heavy equipment extremely difficult, and in some areas, practically impossible. The central waterway of the region was the Berezina River, a right tributary of the Dnieper, 80 to 120 meters wide and up to 3 meters deep. Its winding channel with steep banks presented a serious obstacle for advancing troops. Numerous tributaries of the Berezina, the Bobr, Ptik, Ola, Dobizna rivers, formed a branched hydrographic network, further complicating troop movement. This network of rivers divided the territory into separate sectors, which required special attention to the organization of crossings and forced fording of water obstacles. The road network in the region was extremely poorly developed. Most roads were dirt tracks, which during the spring thaw or prolonged rains became impassable even for tracked vehicles. The few paved roads passed through key settlements and were controlled by German forces. It was these geographical features that predetermined the uniqueness of the Bobruisk operation as a model of military art. The Soviet command had not only to break through the enemy's powerful defenses, but also to do so in conditions where nature seemed to be an ally of the defending side. The German command, assessing the situation, believed that the forested and swampy terrain would nullify the advantage of Soviet troops in tanks and heavy artillery, and numerous water obstacles would become an insurmountable barrier to rapid advancement. However, the command of the First Belarusian Front, led by Rokossovsky, turned the seeming disadvantages of the terrain into its advantages. Dense forests allowed for the covert concentration of troops and equipment, masking the true directions of the main attacks. Swamps were thoroughly studied, and special engineering means were prepared in advance to overcome them. The rivers, which the Germans viewed as part of their defensive system, became directions for rapid flanking maneuvers of Soviet troops. By the start of the Bobruisk operation, the forces of the sides were distributed as follows. The First Belarusian Front, under the command of Army General Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky, numbered 466,000 personnel. It comprised 6 combined arms armies, the 47th, 3rd, 48th, 65th, 28th, and 50th. The strike power of the front consisted of the 1st Guards and 9th Tank Corps, as well as 4 separate tank brigades. In total, Rokossovsky had at his disposal 1,836 tanks and self-propelled artillery installations. The front's artillery grouping included 10,537 guns and mortars of various calibers. Air support was provided by the 16th Air Army of Colonel General of Aviation Sergei Ignatievich Rudenko, numbering 1,646 aircraft. Particularly impressive was the concentration of artillery in the breakthrough sectors, up to 200 barrels per kilometer of front, which ensured overwhelming firepower superiority. Opposing the Soviet troops was the 9th Field Army of the Wehrmacht, under the command of General of Infantry Hans Jordan. It included 5 army corps, the 35th, 41st, 55th, 20th, and 12th. The total strength of the German grouping was about 170,000 personnel. It was equipped with 400 tanks and assault guns, mostly obsolete models, and 3,600 artillery pieces. Air support was provided by the 6th Air Fleet of the Luftwaffe, which had at its disposal about 400 aircraft. Thus, by the start of the operation, a significant superiority of Soviet troops had developed. In manpower, 2.7 times, in tanks and self-propelled guns, 4.6 times, in artillery, 2.9 times, in aviation, 4.1 times. However, a simple numerical comparison does not reflect the full complexity of the upcoming operation. German troops occupied well-prepared defensive positions, had significant experience in conducting defensive battles, and could use the complex terrain to their advantage. A particularly strong aspect of the German defense was its deep echelonment and saturation with anti-tank weapons. In tank-dangerous directions, the density of anti-tank guns reached 20 units per kilometer of front. The command of the 9th Army of the Wehrmacht calculated that, even with the overall numerical superiority of Soviet troops, the complex terrain and powerful defensive structures would nullify the Red Army's advantage in tanks and artillery. However, Rokossovsky and his staff developed a plan that took into account all the features of the opposing grouping and the nature of the terrain. The development of the strategic plan for the Bobruisk operation became one of the brightest pages in Konstantin Rokossovsky's military art. In early June 1944, the details of the upcoming offensive in Belarus were discussed at the Stavka of the Supreme High Command. It was then that Rokossovsky proposed a solution that went against the established canons of military science of that time. Instead of the traditional concentration of forces on a single main strike direction, the commander of the First Belarusian Front insisted on conducting the operation with two equally significant strikes, from the north and south of Bobruisk. This idea met with serious objections from the Stavka. Stalin, after listening to Rokossovsky's report, initially rejected this plan, considering it a risky dispersal of forces. Twice the front commander was forced to leave the Supreme High Commander's office to refine the plan according to the classic scheme with one main strike direction. And twice Rokossovsky returned with the same proposal, deeply convinced of its correctness. Showing a rare persistence for that time, he managed to defend his point of view, arguing it with the peculiarities of the terrain and the disposition of German troops. "Comrade Stalin," Rokossovsky said, "if we deliver two powerful blows in converging directions, the enemy will not be able to maneuver reserves. We will split his defense and create conditions for a rapid encirclement of the Bobruisk grouping." After an intense discussion, Stalin uttered the historic phrase, "The front commander's persistence deserves attention. Approve the operation plan as proposed." Rokossovsky's strategic plan envisioned delivering two powerful blows in converging directions with the aim of encircling and destroying the enemy's Bobruisk grouping. The Northern Strike Group, consisting of the 3rd and 48th Armies, was to advance from the Rogachev area in the general direction of Bobruisk and Osipovichi. The Southern Strike Group, including the 65th and 28th Armies, struck from the Parichi area towards Bobruisk and Slutsk. To develop the success, it was planned to use the 1st Guards and 9th Tank Corps, which, after breaking through the enemy's tactical defense zone, were to rapidly advance deep, cutting off the German troops' retreat routes. Special attention in the plan was paid to the cooperation of various branches of service. Artillery was tasked with providing powerful fire support throughout the operation's depth. The aviation of the 16th Air Army was to gain air superiority, support advancing troops, and prevent the approach of German reserves. Engineer units were given the most complex task of ensuring the overcoming of numerous water obstacles and swampy areas. The uniqueness of Rokossovsky's plan lay in its precise correspondence to the specific operational situation. Two strikes allowed bypassing the most fortified sections of the German defense and exploiting gaps between enemy formations. This approach maximally took into account the peculiarities of the forest-swampy terrain, where the concentration of large forces on a narrow sector was difficult. The success of any major offensive operation largely depends on the ability to conceal one's true intentions from the enemy. In the Bobruisk operation, camouflage and disinformation measures were elevated by the Soviet command to the level of high art. The staff of the First Belarusian Front, under the leadership of Rokossovsky, developed a comprehensive plan for operational camouflage, which included a whole range of interconnected measures. The main task was to convince the German command that the main blow would not be struck in the Bobruisk direction, but in other sectors of the front. To create a false impression of the direction of the main strike, mock-ups of tanks and artillery pieces were demonstratively concentrated in areas far from the actual breakthrough sections. Special teams simulated intensive radio traffic characteristic of large troop formations. In certain sectors of the front, demonstrative engineering works were carried out. False observation posts were built, roads were laid, and crossings over water obstacles were erected. Particular attention was paid to creating false areas of concentration for tank corps. In forest areas, located away from the real directions of attack, hundreds of wooden mock-ups of tanks were installed, carefully camouflaged from enemy aerial reconnaissance. For greater credibility, a high level of activity was maintained in these areas. Field kitchens operated, vehicles moved, and fires were lit at night. To mislead German air reconnaissance, real tanks and artillery moved only at night and were carefully camouflaged during the day. Forest roads and clearings, inaccessible to aerial observation, were used for movement. The engineering units of the front did a colossal job of preparing hidden routes for the advance of troops to the starting positions for the offensive. Dozens of kilometers of column routes were laid through forests and swamps, and hundreds of platforms and corduroy roads were built for the passage of heavy equipment. Parallel to the measures for camouflaging their own troops, active work was carried out to disinform the enemy. Soviet intelligence disseminated false information about the command's plans through various channels. In neutral countries, rumors about the preparation of a major offensive in other sectors of the Soviet-German front were spread through an agent network. A special role in ensuring the secrecy of the offensive's preparation was played by the Smersh counterintelligence agencies. They carried out a series of operations to identify and neutralize German agents in the frontline zone. Dozens of enemy agents who could report on the preparation of the offensive were detained. As a result of the measures taken, the German command was unable to determine the direction of the main strike of the Soviet troops until the last moment. General Hans Jordan, commander of the 9th Army of the Wehrmacht, later admitted in his memoirs, "The Russians managed to completely conceal the scale and direction of the impending offensive. We expected a blow south of Bobruisk, while the main forces of the enemy were concentrated in the north." On June 24, 1944, precisely at 3 o'clock in the morning, the silence of the Belarusian forests was shattered by the roar of thousands of guns. The artillery preparation for the Bobruisk operation had begun. Thousands of shell and mine explosions erupted over German positions. The ground trembled, trees snapped like matchsticks, and enemy fortifications were reduced to piles of rubble. The artillery preparation lasted 2 hours in the northern groupings sector and 1.5 hours in the southern sector. According to the recollections of participants, the intensity of the fire was such that German soldiers in the first line of defense were completely demoralized. Many of them didn't even attempt to resist when Soviet infantry advanced. At 5 o'clock in the morning in the northern sector and at 4:30 in the southern, Soviet troops launched their offensive. Forward battalions crossed the enemy's first line of trenches without a single shot. So effective was the artillery preparation. The German command was caught off guard both by the power of the strike and its direction. The offensive of the Northern Strike Group was particularly successful. General Gorbatov's Third Army broke through the enemy's defenses on a 5-kilometer wide front and advanced up to 8 kilometers deep by the end of the day. General Romanenko's 48th Army also successfully overcame the Germans' first defensive line. By midday, General Panov's 1st Guards Tank Corps was introduced into the breach, rapidly developing the success in the direction of Bobruisk. In the southern sector, the offensive developed at a somewhat slower pace due to more difficult terrain. General Batov's 65th Army and General Luchinsky's 28th Army encountered fierce enemy resistance, especially in the area of the settlement of Parichi. Here, the Germans had created a powerful defense hub with a large number of pillboxes and artillery positions. However, by the end of the day, enemy resistance was broken, and Soviet troops advanced up to 6 kilometers deep. General Jordan, commander of the German 9th Army, realizing the scale of the Soviet offensive, requested permission from Army Group Center Command to withdraw troops from the Bobruisk salient. However, Field Marshal Busch, following Hitler's directive to "stand and die," categorically forbade any retreat. Instead, he directed all available reserves, including the 20th Panzer Division, to the breakthrough area. This decision had catastrophic consequences for the German army. Instead of an orderly withdrawal and the creation of a new defensive line, German troops found themselves caught in a tightening encirclement. By the evening of the first day of the operation, the Soviet command could note with satisfaction that Rokossovsky's plan had begun to be successfully implemented. The enemy's defenses had been broken on two key sectors, creating the preconditions for a deep envelopment of the Bobruisk grouping. Soviet troop losses turned out to be significantly less than expected, thanks to powerful artillery preparation and skillful use of the terrain. The German command, in turn, found itself in a difficult position. Reserves were limited, and two powerful converging strikes made it impossible to maneuver the available forces. The first day of the Bobruisk operation demonstrated the superiority of Soviet military art and laid a strong foundation for the subsequent encirclement and destruction of a large enemy grouping. On June 25, 1944, the Soviet offensive developed rapidly. The Northern Strike Group, having overcome the enemy's tactical defense zone, continued its advance southward. General Panov's 1st Guards Tank Corps, committed to the breakthrough the day before, covered more than 20 kilometers in 24 hours, reaching operational depth. The tank crews skillfully used forest roads and clearings, bypassing enemy strongpoints and advancing towards Bobruisk from the northwest. The Southern Strike Group also made significant progress. General Bogdanov's 9th Tank Corps, having traversed marshy areas over specially prepared corduroy roads, developed its offensive in a northwesterly direction. By the end of the day, the Corps' forward elements reached the area of Glusha settlement, cutting the enemy's most important communication line, the Bobruisk-Slutsk Highway. Thus, the formation of the outer encirclement ring around the German Bobruisk grouping was well underway. The German command, realizing the threat of encirclement, made desperate attempts to halt the Soviet advance. The 20th Panzer Division was urgently transferred to the breakthrough area, launching a counterattack on the flank of the 1st Guards Tank Corps in the Titovka area. Fierce tank battles ensued. Soviet tank crews displayed high skill, maneuvering skillfully between forest massivi and using terrain features. The German counterattack was repelled with heavy losses for the enemy. By the evening of June 25th, the outer encirclement ring was practically formed. Only a narrow corridor, about 15 kilometers wide, remained west of Bobruisk. The commander of the 9th German Army, General Jordan, again requested permission to withdraw troops, but again received a categorical refusal. Field Marshal Busch, executing Hitler's order, demanded that Bobruisk be held at all costs. On the morning of June 26th, the Soviet offensive continued with even greater intensity. The 1st Guards Tank Corps, overcoming enemy resistance, reached the Berezina River west of Bobruisk. Simultaneously, units of the 9th Tank Corps broke through to the same area from the south. The distance between the strike groups narrowed to several kilometers. Understanding the inevitability of complete encirclement, commanders of some German units began, at their own risk, to withdraw troops from the Bobruisk salient. However, it was already too late. Soviet tank crews intercepted the retreating columns and inflicted crushing blows upon them. On June 27, 1944, an event occurred that became the culmination of the Bobruisk operation. The encirclement ring closed around a large enemy grouping. At 10:30 a.m., advanced units of General Panov's 1st Guards Tank Corps met with the vanguard of General Bogdanov's 9th Tank Corps in the area of the village of Chernye Brody, 20 kilometers west of Bobruisk. The moment the two tank corps linked up was marked by a ceremonial salute from all guns. Tankers jumped out of their vehicles, embracing and congratulating each other on their success. This was not just a meeting of two military units. It was a historical event, marking the creation of a classic Kessel, in which 6 German divisions, totaling about 40,000 men, were trapped. The Tank Corps immediately organized a strong defense on the outer encirclement front, deploying anti-tank weapons in the western direction to repel possible attempts at relief from outside. Simultaneously, combined arms armies continued to tighten the ring, methodically destroying the encircled enemy units. The German command, upon learning of the encirclement, fell into a state bordering on panic. General Jordan, commander of the 9th Army, sent a radiogram to the headquarters of Army Group Center, requesting permission to break out of the encirclement. Only now, realizing the catastrophic nature of the situation, did Field Marshal Bush give his consent to a breakthrough. But it was already too late. Soviet troops had created a powerful outer encirclement front, which the demoralized German units had neither the strength nor the means to overcome. Hitler, receiving news of the critical situation near Bobruisk, flew into a rage. He immediately removed Field Marshal Bush from his post, replacing him with Field Marshal Model, who had earned the nickname Führer's Fireman for his ability to stabilize crisis situations on the front. The new commander of Army Group Center urgently formed a relief group from units of the 4th Army and the remnants of the 12th Panzer Division. This group was tasked with breaking through to the encircled troops from the west and providing them with a corridor for escape. However, the very first attempt at relief, undertaken in the afternoon of June 27, ended in complete failure. Soviet aviation, which dominated the air, detected the movement of German columns and inflicted devastating blows on them. Simultaneously, units of the 1st Guards Tank Corps counterattacked the breakthrough group and repelled it with heavy losses. Inside the Kessel, chaos reigned. Communication between the encircled units was disrupted, and troop control was virtually lost. Commanders of individual formations acted on their own initiative, trying to find weak spots in the Soviet defense for a breakthrough. Some small groups of German soldiers tried to infiltrate through the encirclement line in small groups through forests and swamps, but most of them were intercepted by Soviet blocking detachments and partisans. By the end of June 27, the encirclement ring had tightened even further. Soviet artillery continuously fired on enemy concentrations, and aviation launched bombing raids. The situation of the encircled became hopeless. On June 28, 1944, the Soviet command proceeded to the final stage of the Bobruisk operation, the methodical liquidation of the encircled enemy group. Rokossovsky, understanding that the Germans would resist desperately, developed a clear plan for the annihilation of the cauldron. The main idea was to dismember the encircled troops into isolated groups and then destroy them piecemeal. For this purpose, special assault detachments were created, including infantry, tanks, artillery, and sappers. Each such detachment received a specific task to eliminate a particular node of resistance. The first step was to divide the Bobruisk group into two parts. A powerful wedge, consisting of units of the 48th Army, drove into the center of the encircled troops, cutting the cauldron into northern and southern groups. The northern group, numbering about 25,000 men, was pressed against the Berezina River in the vicinity of Bobruisk itself. The southern group, approximately 15,000 men, found itself trapped in the forests west of the city. Aviation of the 16th Air Army continuously bombed enemy concentrations, preventing the Germans from organizing a defense or regrouping. The actions of IL-2 attack aircraft proved particularly effective, literally ironing out columns of German equipment on the roads. According to the recollections of captured German officers, it was the continuous airstrikes that became the main factor demoralizing the encircled troops. Artillery fired from concealed positions, methodically working over identified resistance nodes. Spotter planes and forward observers were widely used to adjust fire. The use of Katyusha rocket launchers proved particularly effective, their fire striking terror into the enemy. German soldiers scattered in panic as soon as they heard the characteristic howl of the rockets. By the evening of June 28th, the southern enemy group was dismembered into several isolated pockets of resistance. Deprived of communication and control, these scattered groups no longer posed a serious threat and were methodically destroyed by Soviet troops. By the morning of June 29th, organized resistance in the southern part of the Cauldron had practically ceased. Thousands of German soldiers, realizing the hopelessness of their situation, surrendered. On June 27th, it became clear that the German command would not tolerate the encirclement of a significant portion of its troops. Field Marshal Model, who assumed command of Army Group Center, immediately began organizing a relief effort. From the west, elements of the 4th Field Army of the Wehrmacht and the remnants of the 12th Panzer Division were hastily drawn towards Bobruisk. The command of the 1st Belarusian Front, foreseeing such a development, had preemptively established a strong outer encirclement front. The 1st Guards and 9th Tank Corps deployed their main forces facing west, organizing a powerful anti-tank defense. Artillery occupied pre-prepared positions, creating a dense curtain of fire in the probable directions of enemy breakthroughs. On June 28th, the Germans made their first serious attempt to break the encirclement. A strike group, including up to 50 tanks and assault guns, supported by infantry, attacked the positions of the 1st Guards Tank Corps in the area of the settlement of Titovka. A fierce battle ensued. Soviet tank crews, skillfully using the terrain, met the enemy with powerful fire. Anti-tank artillery, camouflaged on the edges of forests, opened flanking fire on the advancing German tanks. General Panov, commander of the 1st Guards Tank Corps, skillfully organized the defense. He created an echelon system of anti-tank strongholds and prepared a mobile reserve of heavy IS-2 tanks. When the German attack faltered, this reserve launched a counterattack on the enemy's flank, completely thwarting the breakthrough attempt. The Germans lost 17 tanks and retreated, achieving no results. Soviet aviation played a decisive role in repelling the relief attempts. The 16th Air Army of General Rudenko completely dominated the air. IL-2 attack aircraft continuously patrolled the roads leading to Bobruisk, instantly attacking any detected enemy columns. Fighters reliably covered ground troops, preventing German aviation from providing support to their encircled units. On June 29th, the Germans made another desperate attempt to break through to the encircled group. This time, the attack was carried out by a battle group hastily formed from elements of the 12th and 20th Panzer Divisions. However, by this time the outer encirclement front had been further strengthened. Additional anti-tank assets were concentrated in the threatened direction. Minefields were created and ambushes were organized. The German attack was met with concentrated artillery fire and salvos from Katyusha rocket launchers. Aviation launched a massive strike on the advancing enemy units. The German offensive faltered, not even reaching the first line of Soviet defense. Simultaneously with repelling the relief attempts, the Soviet command took measures to prevent the supply of encircled troops by air. The Germans tried to organize an airlift, using Junkers 52 transport planes to deliver ammunition and provisions to the encircled units. However, Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft artillery created an insurmountable barrier. Of the 38 transport aircraft that attempted to break through to the encircled troops, 22 were shot down, and the rest turned back, failing to complete their mission. On June 29, 1944, the final phase of the Bobruisk operation began. The northern grouping of encircled German troops, pressed against the Berezina River in the Bobruisk area, made a desperate attempt to break out of the encirclement. Around 5 o'clock in the morning, the Germans concentrated the remnants of their armored vehicles and, under the cover of artillery fire, attacked the positions of the 48th Army on the western outskirts of the city. The strike was delivered with the fury of the doomed. German soldiers understood that this was their last chance to avoid capture or death. The Soviet command had foreseen such a development. Artillery observers, pre-positioned on high-rise buildings in Bobruisk, immediately detected the concentration of German troops and transmitted the coordinates to the firing positions. Dozens of artillery batteries opened concentrated fire on the advancing enemy columns. Katyusha rocket launchers covered the German starting positions with a hail of fire. The breakthrough was stopped before it could even begin. The German command, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, decided at 10 o'clock in the morning to capitulate the main forces. Lieutenant General Lutz, who had taken command of the encircled troops after the death of the commander of the 35th Army Corps, gave the order to cease resistance. White flags appeared over the positions of 3 infantry divisions. Thousands of German soldiers with raised hands emerged from the forests and ruined fortifications, laying down their arms before Soviet units. However, not all German units obeyed the order to capitulate. Fanatical SS officers and some army commanders decided to continue the fight. Scattered groups of the enemy, totaling up to 5,000 men, hid in the forests west of Bobruisk, hoping to break through to their own troops or hold out until help arrived from outside. The Soviet command, seeking to avoid unnecessary casualties, offered these groups to surrender, guaranteeing their lives. Parliamentaries with an ultimatum to surrender were sent across the front line. In some cases, this had an effect. Individual units laid down their arms without a fight, but the most fanatical groups rejected the ultimatum and continued their resistance. To eliminate these pockets, special assault groups were created, including infantry, tanks, and flamethrower units. Methodically, square by square, they combed the forest areas, identifying and destroying the last centers of resistance. By the evening of June 29, organized enemy resistance in the Bobruisk area had completely ceased. The results of the operation were impressive. According to official data, during the liquidation of the encircled grouping, more than 40,000 German soldiers and officers were killed, and about 26,000 were taken prisoner. Huge trophies were captured, hundreds of guns, thousands of machine guns, dozens of warehouses with military equipment. The Ninth Army of the Wehrmacht effectively ceased to exist as a combat-ready formation. The success of the Bobruisk operation was largely determined by effective military technical support and the interaction of all branches of the armed forces. Artillery truly became the god of war, playing a decisive role in breaching the deeply echeloned enemy defenses. In the directions of the main attacks, the concentration of artillery reached unprecedented levels, up to 200 guns per kilometer of front. Such a density of fire literally swept away enemy defensive positions. Artillery preparation was carried out using a new method. Instead of evenly distributing fire across the entire depth of the defense, the main efforts were concentrated on the first line of fortifications, ensuring their complete destruction. The use of heavy howitzers and mortars, capable of destroying reinforced concrete fortifications and dugouts, proved particularly effective. Rocket artillery, the famous Katyushas, was used for massive fire support in breakthrough sectors and in repelling enemy counterattacks. The salvos of rocket launchers had not only a physical but also a powerful psychological impact on the enemy. Tank and mechanized formations demonstrated high skill in operating in difficult, forested and swampy terrain. The 1st Guards and 9th Tank Corps successfully overcame swampy areas along specially prepared corduroy roads and decking, which were created in advance by engineer units. For passage through forest areas, pre-reconnoitered clearings and forest roads were used. Tankers skillfully maneuvered between natural obstacles, flanking and getting behind the enemy. The tactic of tank ambushes proved particularly effective in repelling attempts to unblock the encircled group. Heavy IS-2 tanks, camouflaged on the edges of forests, met advancing German columns with concentrated fire from close range, inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. Soviet aviation gained complete air superiority, which became one of the key factors in the success of the operation. The 16th Air Army of General Rudenko effectively solved a variety of tasks, from direct support of advancing troops to blocking the approach of enemy reserves. Il-2 attack aircraft, operating in groups of 8 to 12 machines, delivered pinpoint strikes against strongholds, artillery positions, and concentrations of enemy armored vehicles. Fighters reliably covered ground troops, preventing German aviation from supporting their encircled units. Bombers systematically destroyed communications deep within the enemy's defenses, hindering the approach of reserves. The engineering support of the operation deserves special attention. Sappers did a tremendous job of clearing passages through enemy minefields, building crossings over numerous rivers and streams, and creating column routes through swampy areas. In the sector of the 48th Army's offensive alone, more than 20,000 mines were defused, and 14 bridges were built over water obstacles in the first 2 days of the operation. Signalmen ensured uninterrupted communication between all elements of the battle order, allowing the command to quickly react to changes in the situation. Radio stations, field telephones, and mobile communication means were widely used. Rear services organized a clear supply system for advancing troops with ammunition, fuel, and provisions. Medical units effectively evacuated the wounded and provided them with timely assistance. The Bobruisk operation demonstrated the highest level of interaction between various branches of the armed forces. Artillery, tanks, aviation, and infantry acted as a single coherent mechanism, complementing and reinforcing each other. This interaction was carefully planned during the preparation phase of the operation and maintained throughout its execution thanks to reliable communication and clear command. The successful military technical support of the Bobruisk operation was made possible by the increased technical equipment of the Red Army, the skill of commanders at all levels, and the high morale of Soviet soldiers. The Bobruisk operation became one of the most successful encirclement military operations in the entire history of the Great Patriotic War. Its results exceeded the wildest expectations of the Soviet command. Over 6 days of fighting, the troops of the First Belarusian Front liberated a significant territory of Belarus, covering an area of over 10,000 square kilometers, including the large regional center of Bobruisk and dozens of other settlements. But the main outcome of the operation was the defeat of a powerful enemy grouping. The 9th Army of the Wehrmacht ceased to exist as a combat-ready formation. According to official data, over 40,000 German soldiers and officers were killed during the operation, and about 26,000 were taken prisoner. Among the prisoners were the commander of the 35th Army Corps, Lieutenant General Lutz, and several division commanders. The trophies of the Soviet troops were impressive: 490 tanks and assault guns, 2,600 artillery pieces, 5,000 vehicles, and huge warehouses with military equipment. The losses of Soviet troops in the Bobruisk operation amounted to about 21,000 people, of which irretrievable losses were about 6,000. Such a loss ratio, approximately 1 to 11 in favor of Soviet troops, clearly demonstrates the highest level of military art displayed by the command and troops of the First Belarusian Front. The strategic importance of the Bobruisk operation can hardly be overestimated. It became one of the key elements of Operation Bagration, as a result of which Belarus was completely liberated and prerequisites were created for an offensive into Poland and the Baltic states. The destruction of the Bobruisk enemy grouping opened the way for Soviet troops to Minsk and Baranovichi, which subsequently allowed for the encirclement and defeat of the Minsk enemy grouping. The defeat of the 9th Army of the Wehrmacht created a huge gap in the defenses of the German Army Group Center, which the German command was no longer able to close. This led to a strategic catastrophe for the Wehrmacht on the central sector of the Eastern Front. Hitler was forced to urgently redeploy reserves from other directions, weakening defenses in the Baltic states, Poland, and even on the Western Front, where Allied forces were advancing after the Normandy landings. The Bobruisk operation also had important international significance. The defeat of a large grouping of German troops demonstrated the growing power of the Red Army and brought closer the final defeat of Nazi Germany. The success of Soviet troops in Belarus had a significant impact on the political decisions of allies and neutral countries. The Bobruisk operation has forever entered the textbooks of military art as a benchmark for the successful encirclement and destruction of a large enemy grouping in the most difficult natural conditions. Analyzing its conduct, military theorists identify several key principles that ensured the triumph of Soviet arms in the Belarusian forests and swamps. The first, and perhaps most important lesson, was the principle of unconventional strategic thinking. Rokossovsky's decision to deliver two equally significant blows instead of the traditional single main blow contradicted the canons of military science of that time, but perfectly corresponded to the specific operational situation. The commander's ability to defend his point of view before the country's top leadership demonstrates the importance of a creative approach to military art. The second principle is the ability to turn terrain disadvantages into advantages. The forested and swampy nature of the theater of operations, which the Germans considered their ally, was used by the Soviet command for covert concentration of troops and masking the directions of the main blows. The third lesson of the Bobruisk operation is the masterful use of military cunning and disinformation. A complex of measures for operational camouflage allowed for the achievement of tactical surprise, even in conditions of positional warfare. The fourth principle is the organization of clear interaction among all branches of service. Artillery, tanks, aviation, and infantry acted as a single coherent mechanism, greatly enhancing each other's effectiveness. The fifth lesson is flexibility in troop command. The front command promptly reacted to changes in the situation, timely shifting efforts to the most promising directions. The sixth principle is methodicalness in eliminating the encircled grouping. The dismemberment of the cauldron into isolated parts with their subsequent destruction allowed for minimizing own losses. The seventh lesson is reliable blocking of attempts to relieve the encirclement from outside. The creation of a strong outer front of encirclement, with the concentration of sufficient forces and means on it, prevented the breakthrough of German troops to the encircled grouping. The relevance of these principles for modern military science and practice is obvious. Despite revolutionary changes in weaponry and technology, the fundamental foundations of military art demonstrated in the Bobruisk operation retain their significance. Modern military conflicts confirm the importance of creative thinking, the ability to adapt to terrain features, achieving surprise, and organizing inter-service interaction. The Bobruisk operation became not just a victory for Soviet arms, it became a model of military art that is still studied in military academies around the world.